I'm Corey, and this is the Hardcore Skeptic Examines. Hey folks, this is the fourth installment of the Hardcore Skeptic Examines Social Justice series. And in this one, I'm interviewing Edwin, who is a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Victoria. He covers gender and masculinity, and he covers extremist groups. This is a great interview. I really enjoyed this, but I'm challenged because I have to be as hard on my side as I was on the other side. I'm going to try very hard to take everything that Edwin says with a grain of salt, and I'll fact check the few things that may come across as requiring it. It's often very easy to try to pick apart the arguments on the opposite side. You can dismiss the things that they say easier. You can dismiss their sources easier. Part of the exercise that I'm participating in right with this is the act of honesty. I'm trying to be as honest as possible. And in that vein, I will be trying to fact check and trying to perhaps push back on some of the things that Edwin says. That said, I have a little bit of housekeeping to take care of before I start the interview. First, I want to say that I'm getting a little bit of flack for some of my commentary, and that's fine. That's all well and good. If you disagree with the things that I say, then that's fine. If you feel like I've misrepresented anybody, then I apologize. My intent was to, after the fact, there were claims when I was listening to the interviews. They need to be checked out. The fact that some things proved true and some things proved false stands up. That's reasonable. If somebody wants to critique my research methods, my quote-unquote research methods, that's fine too. When it comes to a news story, a quick Google search is generally all you need to find out whether or not it's legit. If you find that, say, a UCLA segregated housing story is from collegefix.com, or that it's from right-wing critics of universities, and that multiple other sources say that it's not segregated housing, including a reliable one, aka Snopes, then that's fine. That's reasonable. You don't have to believe me. You don't have to accept what I'm saying. I encourage you to double check everything. This is kind of the point. Like, I wasn't going to take Randy or Dustin's word on things. Now, a little further along that vein, Simone Sanders. There's still some dispute about her quote between me and Dustin. The quote that was given to me during the interview was, "We don't need white people leading the Democratic Party." Okay, that sounds pretty damning. The problem is that that's not the only thing she said. There's an entire paragraph around that. This is something I pointed out in my commentary, and Dustin took issue with it. So I didn't read the quote. I'll read the quote now. She says, "In my opinion, we don't need white people leading the Democratic Party right now. The Democratic Party is diverse, and it should be reflected as so in leadership and throughout the staff, at the highest levels, from the vice chairs to the secretaries, all the way down to the people working in the offices at the DNC. I think we need a robust discussion about this, and I think we need to hear more from all the candidates. Jamie Harrison of South Carolina, he's great too. He's done real party building, but everybody doesn't necessarily know Jamie, and they want to know what he stands for. So I want to hear more from everybody. I want to hear from the millennials and the brown folks." So that's the entire quote. After reading that, I was led to believe that she was, in fact, calling for more diversity of leadership, not an ethno-purity of the Democratic Party. More young people, more brown people. That does tend to mean less old white people, but it's not because it's anti-white rhetoric. I actually sent a message to Simone Sanders asking her what she meant by that. I asked her, is this anti-white rhetoric? Is this a call to get whites out of the leadership of the Democratic Party? And I'm going to just read exactly what she wrote back to me. Quote, My view is simple. Nearly 50% of the voting membership of the party are people of color, but that was not reflected across the board in leadership. Representation matters, and I think that the Democratic Party especially has to be intentional when it comes to making sure people of color are visible and represented. So I was advocating for a competent, capable, and qualified chair that also had a little bit of melanin. It isn't anti-white rhetoric. I believe it's called being intentional about diversity and inclusion." End quote. So to me, that's it. I think that's pretty clear right from the horse's mouth. She meant more diversity, more young people, more brown people. That's not the same thing as saying no whites. Again, I think I said this in the original commentary. The first line sounds bad when taken out of the entirety of it, but I feel that that's cherry picking. So that's it. I'm not going to talk about Simone Sanders anymore. I appreciate her input. If she happens to listen to this, I really appreciate the feedback. Okay, so now I also have I got some feedback about the logical fallacy argument I had regarding Randy's points on systemic racism can't be proven by a wage gap for people of color. So Randy said that this is a logical fallacy called affirming the consequent. And I said in my commentary that I don't care if it qualifies under the logical fallacy. I kind of figured that logical fallacy or not, this formal logic thing, it makes it irrelevant or is irrelevant. And that we should be following kind of an argumentation format where it's a claim, systemic racism exists. What are our lines of evidence? And then one of those lines of evidence can be a wage gap for people of color. And like I say, I got some feedback saying that it's either a logical fallacy or it isn't, and that I need to address this better. But I also got some more feedback from another listener who said, "I disagree with you that the logical form is irrelevant. The issue with this argument isn't that the logical fallacy doesn't matter, but that he misapplied the logical fallacy," he being Randy, "and largely because he mistakenly assumed the evidence provided was a proof rather than an example. Essentially, he asked for evidence, and when evidence was provided, he appears to have assumed that this evidence was sufficient to establish the conclusion. In his mind, the argument took the following form. If systemic racism exists, then there must be a wage gap. There is a wage gap between people of color and white people. Therefore, systemic racism exists. This is affirming the consequent. This actually is a logical fallacy because the conclusion does not necessarily fall from the premises. Other explanations can be provided to explain a wage gap other than asserting systemic racism. However, acknowledging that this argument is a logical fallacy does not entail that systemic racism does not exist. It simply asserts that the argument as stated does not adequately establish the conclusion. This is where he got it wrong, where Randy got it wrong. The argument above isn't the argument that was made. He assumed that the wage gap was presented as an individually sufficient conclusion, but it's not. It's only one example that, when paired with multiple other pieces of evidence, together become mutually sufficient. The affirming the consequent fallacy relies upon the possible existence of other explanations for the evidence, ones that don't involve the stated conclusion. However, with added pieces of evidence, other possible conclusions begin to be ruled out. When you add the wage gap to things like reporting bias on race, bias in the legal system against people of color, TV representations of people of color, studies on the effects of poverty and the overrepresentation of people of color in poverty, and so on, the picture becomes clearer and clearer, and the alternative explanations start to vanish. In the face of the mounting evidence, rather than a solitary piece of evidence, the fallacy is extinguished, and the argument begins to stand on its own. The mounting evidence becomes mutually sufficient. That is, even if no individual piece of evidence is itself enough to support the conclusion, together they are. So yes, it's still important to understand logical fallacies, and if an argument actually is fallacious, then it cannot be relied upon. But that wasn't the issue here. This guy simply mischaracterized the point being made, and so he inaccurately applied a fallacy that didn't actually apply. Essentially, he argued against a straw man or another fallacy. So that's the argument I got from a listener who can say it way better than I can. I I feel that this, in part, is what I was getting at. This is the multiple lines of evidence is something that I was talking about in my argumentation point. I do concede that the logical fallacy is important. I suppose when I guess that's it. I'll stop it at that. I do concede that the logical fallacy is important, but I do not see this explanation as incompatible with my argumentation points about multiple lines of evidence helping us to draw the conclusion. So that's that. I guess I already said, like, I'm going to try and be critical of Edwin's points during the interview. I want to be as honest as possible. I know where my bias lies, and all my listeners do as well. So with that said, I intend to do some commentary after the fact, and hopefully some of this stuff is cleared up. I hope that, frankly, I'm done talking about some of it. So thanks very much to people who gave me feedback. Thanks very much to those who support the show. I genuinely appreciate all the support. So with that said, I've been rambling on for 13 minutes now. I'm going to edit this down as much as I can, and then I will see you after the interview. Okay, so I guess we might as well just start off with a bit of an introduction. Who are you, and what is your background?
Sure. So my name's Edwin, and in terms of formal titles, I guess the most accurate is I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology.
Okay. University name redacted.
I have a couple of primary research focuses. The first is men and masculinities, so I focus on gender.
Okay.
Looking at masculinities, and the other component is I look at extremist social movements. So I do a lot of research into sovereign citizens and freemen on the land, white supremacist groups, that sort of thing.
Oh, wow. Sounds interesting.
I like to think so.
Yeah. So just to start with a basic question, like, what is, to your view, what is social justice?
Well, it's a big question with sort of it depends on what level you're looking at. Academically, you can think of the concept of social justice as it's kind of a catch-all term for the study of marginalization and social inequality. But it's more than just trying to understand the roots of social inequality. Oftentimes, social justice in the academic world has sort of a policy bent to it. It's designed, or its focus is developing policy to try to address or ameliorate the social inequality that's identified. At a sort of a more populist level, I guess, and sort of a lay person's level, or a lay person's way of understanding, is social justice is something of again, it's a catch-all term to describe a constellation of social movements. Again, looking at social inequality, but rather than constructing sort of policy papers, much of the work is more grassroots in the sense that social justice advocates and activists are out trying to sort of address social inequality from the grassroots level.
Okay. So I guess that grassroots level, that would be like groups like Black Lives Matter or the odd feminist organization.
So yeah, Black Lives Matter is a great example of a grassroots organization. In the Canadian context, Idle No More,
okay,
which is an Indigenous activist group. It's tied into a broader constellation of Indigenous resurgence movements. Those are examples. Certainly, a number of feminist groups and feminist organizations would fall into that rubric as well, as would any number of other anti-racist, anti-homophobic, pro-immigrant, pro-labor movements. All of these would fall under that broad umbrella term.
Okay. So I guess that kind of speaks to the idea that social justice isn't just one big thing. It's a bunch of different movements.
Yeah, the best way of thinking of social justice. So social justice, you're right, it's not a monolith. Social justice is just a descriptor that's attached to the orientation or even sort of the ideological goal of different social movements. You don't see sort of a network. There's no like central command for SOCJUS, right? It's what you see is a network of independent organizations, often with different orientations and different foci, but all pushing towards the same general goal, which is increased access to sort of the social world, increased access to social capital and social power.
Okay. So do you think that these groups are separating people more than they're bringing them together? Like, does it do them a disservice to, say, single out Indigenous people or Black people or women versus men type things?
No, I don't think so. I think that's actually that dichotomy, are we bringing them together or breaking them apart, is rooted in kind of a false narrative that society doesn't already do that. So when sociologists or anthropologists or human geographers or statisticians or demographers look at society and look at these large social trends, society is already delineated. It's already broken up along these lines. Some groups have access to some social institutions or some social capital, while others don't. A lot of groups, so Black Lives Matter, for example, isn't breaking people up along racial lines. It's recognizing that difference, that demarcation is already there and is a really strong predictor of of things like poverty, of levels of education or socioeconomic status. So no, I don't see them as breaking groups apart. They're simply recognizing that a difference exists and that difference also is tied up with questions of inequality.
Okay. I guess in that vein, does that recognition of already existing inequalities, do we assign a certain level of status or oppression? Like, is there an oppression Olympics, like Dave Rubin likes to say?
I actually have no idea who this guy is, and I assume that he has very little training in social sciences.
Right.
But no, the notion that there's oppression Olympics is the idea. It seems to me that's the idea that groups of people are actively competing with one another to find out which one of them is the most oppressed. Is that
that's kind of the idea? Or that social justice warriors give, say, a Black gay person more status on the social justice ladder than a white straight person, or or even just a white gay person or a straight Black person. Like, so that's kind of what they mean by that, I guess.
Do the people that are pushing this notion, do they have do they quantify it, or do they give us how do they determine the points that we're supposed to be assigning?
Well, actually, I did see this. I'm not sure what the source was, but I did see a kind of a chart that said like a person of color gets 100 points or whatever, where a white person loses 100 points, or
Right.
And I kind of thought that it was a joke the way I saw it, but I have seen a BuzzFeed article where they say you answer these 100 questions, and then they kind of say, yeah, well, you probably have X level of privilege. So
right. So this is a really interesting phenomenon that, concepts like privilege and oppression or marginalization, we talk about them in different ways in academia than it seems to be out there in the world.
Right.
Insofar as there is any real distinction between academia and the world anymore. But the notion that we assign, and by we I mean people that are involved in any kind of progressive activism, assign like, oh well, no, are you Black and gay and disabled? Well, you are, there's, I don't know. You have minus 50 points on the Martin Luther King scale of oppression. Like,
right.
That's not a thing.
Yeah.
What we can do, though, is we can look at demographics and we can say, look, when we look at stats, when we look at sort of general social surveys or household surveys or national surveys or even international surveys, what we can find is that there are some pretty significant correlations between a person's gender and, say, income level,
Right.
or race and income level, or ability and income level. People who in Canada, if people in surveys identify as, they write check the box, disabled, they have a physical disability, we see statistically there's a far greater chance that that person will also indicate that they have lower socioeconomic status, that they have lower average income. The same holds true with women. The same holds true with any member of a minority or marginalized group. Is this Oppression Olympics? No, it's a pretty bog standard statistical trend.
Right.
And the trend lines are pretty, they're pretty regular. They're pretty standard. We can see this over years. We can see this across countries.
Yeah, it almost sounds like this thing that is being called Oppression Olympics, say by anti-SJ people, it's actually more like a description of a statistical trend that exists whether we like it or not.
Yeah. I mean, if you are let's think of it in terms of the United States. If you are, let's say we're 1956. If you are a black woman, well, you're going to be sort of ostracized from or prevented from entering into sort of mainstream American society, or if you do, it'll be in a segregated kind of way. Right. If you're a woman, so that's along racial lines. But because you're a woman, even if you could enter into those spaces, you also would be prevented from, for example, applying for a credit card. Because
Right.
women in the United States weren't able to apply for credit on their own until the 1970s. So not only could, because of her racial status, would she be sort of unable to do things like go to an Ivy League institution, right? Go to top tier universities. She also would be more likely to be living in poverty and, a whole number of other things. Now, that's not Oppression Olympics. It's just a simple observation.
Right.
I think often what happens is, I'm going to assume that Dave Rubin is not a fan of.
Yeah, he's a talk show guy. He's put out videos about why he left the left and things like that. So,
yeah, I honestly, I don't understand that particular notion either. I don't identify as a leftist, but my policies, the policies I endorse, certainly put me there.
Right.
I don't recognize the left as some monolithic movement that I could leave. The only way that I could conceivably leave the left is if I suddenly decided that restorative justice and equality of opportunity and equality of equity and outcome. If I thought these things were all bullshit suddenly, so
Right.
it's not like I just could turn in my card. I'd have to fundamentally change how I view the world.
Right. That kind of takes me off of my normal question list, because I was talking to another guy who was talking about the difference between equality and equity of outcome, and how he thought that, like, the one that quote unquote leftists talk about, the equity of outcome, he seemed to feel that this was almost a dictator-like or totalitarian type of idea.
Yeah, that sounds like something that I imagine an opponent of that notion would say. I think often what happens is when you hear something like equity or equality of outcome, some people immediately say, "Oh, well, what that means is that we demand that every single person earn exactly the same amount of money, that every single person, regardless of qualifications, gets to have whatever job they want." And that's not necessarily what we're talking about. In terms of equality of outcome, does everyone in a society have more or less equal access to healthcare, to education? If a person who is born if a person who's born and grew up in Tuktoyaktuk, are they able to gain access to, say, entrance to the University of Toronto? right?
Right.
If a person is born in an impoverished urban setting to parents who make combined less than 20,000 a year, do they have access to adequate healthcare, education, after school programs, whatever? It's not setting a one-to-one for every single person who's out there in the world trying to make a name for themselves or whatever.
Right.
It's simply saying, does everyone in society have equal access to the fruits of society? Does everyone in society have access to healthcare and education? If yes, then that is a more egalitarian outcome than the other way, which is saying, oh no, everyone has the right, everyone has the opportunity to strive and succeed. But that perspective often overlooks things like, if I'm born to a working single mother in an impoverished family out in rural Canada, unless I have some pretty significant support systems to help, I will not be able to compete with an upper middle class, or an upper class white kid that lives in a wealthy suburb in Toronto, right?
Right. I suppose that kind of brings me to the idea that when we're looking for this increased opportunity for people who have lesser chances at it, does that punish groups that how do I word this? I guess the question I have is, do some groups get punished based on their race or gender when we attempt to lift other groups up, or give an additional opportunity to disadvantaged groups?
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on there. One of the first things that immediately occurs to me is that oftentimes that discussion takes as a hidden premise the notion that people in marginalized groups aren't good enough on their own already. It's basically assuming that people in the dominant group are the only ones who are really qualified, really, for these jobs and opportunities,
right,
and that we're giving these opportunities and jobs to people who really aren't qualified at all. But that's not, in fact, what we're trying to do, or what these policies are trying to do. So there's been an example is that I use this with my students, is the resume test that was done. It's been done a number of times, but
oh yeah, I think I've heard of that.
Yeah, these are identical resumes, literally identical and completely randomized. There's anonymized, and they get sent out, and we see the kinds of callbacks that they get, and then we construct a model of callbacks and how, who's getting, which ones are getting called back, and which, just
right,
how popular these resumes are. And then we send them out again, but we give them racialized names. So half of them say Jason and the other half say Darius, or half of them say Jane and the other half say like Lakeisha. And what we see is that these are the identical resumes, and all of a sudden, if you have a racialized sounding name, you're 50% less likely to get a callback. So
right, yeah.
The qualifications are the same, right? They are literally the same because they're identical. And yet we see that racial bias does fit in, or gender bias, or whatever. So a lot of these policies, they're not punishing people. They're simply saying, there are these biases that we know exist. We have recorded them. We have multiple instances of these biases existing. This is an attempt to ameliorate. Now, on an individual level, are some people possibly shortchanged in the system? Yeah, sure. I don't know. Probably. But on an aggregate, when we're looking at these large-scale societal trends, it seems that these do far more good than harm.
Right.
And they're not perfect, right? But we don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. They're not perfect, but they do help, and that's important.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. I guess one of the things that I've heard is that quite often, I guess you kind of addressed it, quite often these social justice ideas, they focus on the larger groups of people, and sometimes the individual gets left behind. I wonder, is there something to that criticism? Or I guess like I say, you kind of touched on it already, but.
Yeah, absolutely. There's something to that. For when you go out into the world and you ask people about their experiences, yeah, we often get outliers or people who come from unique experience or backgrounds, or who've had a unique scenario occur, right? Or yeah, absolutely. But again, sort of when we're trying to think of these social problems, social inequality, the emphasis is on the social, right? We're not looking at fixing every single individual person's issues. Can you imagine what kind of program or movement that would be, like, where each and every person, you had to go out one by one and fix their problems? The idea is that you work on these social trends and you say, look, if we can increase the overall earnings potentials of a marginalized group, let's say increase the overall earnings potentials of Black working class men, right? That is going to have a societal effect. It means that more working class Black men, for example, may go on for retraining and skills training. They may, through these increased opportunities that financial stability brings, increase their own social, move out of impoverished classes, right? Have upward social mobility. That has generational effects. That has all kinds of knock-on effects. So social justice groups will often look at the social, because it seems that of all the things we've tried, policies that target large groups of people seem to have the most effect.
Right. Yeah. You can't really affect each individual person and take every variable in their lives into account when you're laying out policy, right?
Exactly. That's not how policy works.
Yeah.
Ringing up Justin Trudeau and saying, "Listen, Justin, I'm sitting here in Victoria and I wish I had a little bit more money. Can you talk to my boss maybe?
Yeah.
Just make sure that everything's on the up and up."
I kind of feel like I'm paying too much tax,
Yeah. Can we just adjust those taxes like on an individual basis?
Yeah, that's right.
I'd like taxes a la carte, please.
Yeah. So I guess I'm going to try and shift the focus a little bit. What do you think of the idea that social justice movements are anti-free speech?
Yeah, I hear this one fairly often as well. And the first thing I try to do when I counter that is to ask the person, what do you mean by free speech?
Right. So just to play devil's advocate.
Yeah.
If I'm online and I'm posting an opinion or something and Facebook bans me for a few days, is that a free speech issue?
Not by any legal standard I know.
Okay.
So I guess that's part of the problem. Is the issue that I see is ideas like free speech, which incidentally is an American term relating to American constitutional protections.
Right.
In Canada, we have the freedom of expression.
Right.
Subtly different, but different nonetheless. These are legal concepts. They are constructed, they are articulated by the state's legal apparatus, and grant certain rights and privileges. Is a private entity like Facebook telling you, listen, you don't get to talk on this platform for 24 hours. Is that a violation of free speech? No, because you can pick up your soapbox and you can go someplace else.
Right.
You can stand in your front yard and scream about the Illuminati Jews from the center of the earth that are coming to kill all the whoever's. It doesn't matter. You can say whatever you want.
Right.
But Facebook saying, listen, what you've said is objectionable enough that it violates the standards that you've agreed to when you signed up for this service, that we're going to punch you off for a while. Yeah, that's not a violation of free speech. That's a consequence of your speech.
Right. Yeah. So I guess what if somebody wants consequence-free speech? What if they feel that they should be able to say what they want without getting any social backlash from it?
I mean, I would ask them to explain to me how they think society works.
Yeah.
There's a reason when early political theorists or early philosophers, in the Enlightenment, talked about society in terms of the social contract. Contracts are limiting things, right? A contract doesn't grant you rights; it curtails freedoms, right?
Right.
You agree to give up something in exchange for gaining something else. If you want to take part in society, if you want to take part in a social space, you have to recognize, just logically, that some of the things you say, people might push back against. And people pushing back against you isn't a violation of your free speech. They're saying, hey, you're kind of being an asshole. Maybe dial that back a bit. If you refuse, well, they have the right to shut you out.
Right.
Now, if it's the state that's coming down on you, dropping the hammer and saying the following words are verboten, then okay, now we're into different territory. And in Canada, we certainly have a debate around that. We do have hate speech laws,
right,
which,
yeah,
for the record, I tend to be in favor of. But the notion that you're shit posting on Reddit and somebody bans you and that's free speech. No, sorry, that's not how that works.
Right.
Get learned.
So, I guess in that vein, what about the idea that universities will sometimes no platform or disinvite speakers from their campuses?
Again, depends on the context, depends on the person. So for example, what's that guy's name?
Milo Yiannopoulos?
Yeah, YOLO Minneapolis or whatever his name is. A university. So depending on the kind of the orientation of the university, is it a private university, a public university, whatever? Universities have the right to both invite and disinvite people. That is absolutely their right. If this actually happened back in the 90s, there was can't remember if it was University of Alberta or some student group in Alberta, I believe, invited Ernst Zundel to come and speak to a group of people. And Ernst Zundel I can't remember if he's still alive, was a notorious anti-Semite, Holocaust denier, white supremacist. And not only was he disinvited from speaking when the institution got a hold of it, but I think he was also kicked out of the country.
Oh, wow.
Well, Canada, teaching Holocaust denial is illegal.
That's a major thing, yeah.
Yeah, I can't go into my class and say, let's talk about how the Jews are all liars. And really, a few of them died, but it was their own damn fault for not eating the food the kindly Germans provided in their work camps.
Right.
Teaching that is straight up illegal for good reason, right?
For sure.
But other times, so the University of Victoria had a group of anti-choice activists, anti-abortion activists that showed up and were displaying graphic images of what they said were aborted fetuses, and probably most of the pictures were. And the student society basically disinvited them, said, nope, you don't get to do that here. And they took it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled, no, actually, you don't have that right on university campuses. University campuses are a weird space in Canada. But should universities disinvite? I think if there is a credible risk to the student body, yeah, absolutely. I think that universities ought to maintain their status as curators of the very best knowledge, the very best arguments, the very best science and literature and culture. They shouldn't just be open spaces for any asshole to roll up and start screaming about how he hates black people.
So you don't necessarily prescribe to the idea that university campuses should be the open marketplace of ideas and all ideas are welcome and bad ideas should be countered by good ideas and somehow that will have the best ideas come out on top?
No, because we know that doesn't happen. If history has taught us anything, it's that doesn't happen. In the United States, and this is sort of apropos for what we're talking about. Skeptics and atheists for years, we have fought against young Earth creationists coming into schools, into universities, into high schools, and demanding that young Earth creationism be taught in biology classes or in science classes. And their argument is one of them is the argument you just gave. Well, in the marketplace of ideas, we can present all ideas and someone can pick and choose what they want. No, it's a bad idea. We know it's a bad idea. We fought that fight a century ago and they lost. Why should we relitigate that every single year? Some ideas, the debate has been had. The debate has been fought by previous generations. So if I have to answer every charge by every, whatever they call themselves, anti-social justice or whatever, If I have to answer every charge in every class of every bad argument that they found on the internet, I'll never actually be able to teach the good ideas.
Right. It actually ends up stifling the exchange of ideas, doesn't it?
Well, sure. Bad ideas are easy to come up with and they're hard to refute.
Yeah.
It takes you 2 seconds to say something shitty. It takes me an hour and a half to deconstruct it and show why it's wrong.
Yeah, that's right. I guess that kind of speaks to the idea like that skeptics have been fighting against pseudoscience and such for so long, and people like David Avocado Wolf can just make stuff up and post it on his Facebook page and get thousands, millions of likes. And
the guy gives avocados a bad name.
Yeah, that's right. So this is still in the same vein, I guess. Speech codes. Yeah. What are your thoughts on restricting speech on campuses just in general?
So first, what is a speech code? I've never actually heard of this.
Supposedly, I looked it up, and speech codes started in the UK in the 70s, where they were trying to stop hate groups from recruiting on campuses.
Sure. Okay.
And some of these moved over to North America and Canada and maybe not Canada, but in the US in the 70s and in the 80s, I guess. And some in the 90s, they became very popular, and they kind of, I guess they restrict some certain forms of speech. It'd be like hate speech laws, but on campuses.
Okay. Well, without as I say, I've never really heard of this, and I don't think I've yet to encounter something like this. But
there's nothing like that at the university that you're at.
I mean, there might be, but it may be in a form that maybe I'm like, it could just be that I'm not understanding what they are. But if I have it right, my response would be, absent any concrete examples of this happening, would be that the university's job is to educate. That's right. The job of the university. The job of individual instructors within the university is to provide an environment, a classroom environment, a departmental environment, an environment that is conducive to learning. And we know that people learn best when they're comfortable to exchange ideas in a space where they won't be attacked, where they don't have to feel sort of unsafe. And the idea. So there was an example I can give from a few years ago of a guy in an introductory class declaring at the beginning that he firmly believed that Jews were attempting to initiate a white genocide.
Jeez.
And that he had to be punted out of the classroom.
Right.
Why? Because that kind of language immediately sets up a hostile learning environment where no one can be relaxed enough to engage in the kind of intellectual exercises that we need them to in order to educate. And what are we supposed to do with that, guy? Say, oh, well, bust out your hood and your swastika, come up on stage and let's debate for 3 hours. That is not the space for that.
Right. I can hear the anti-SJ side of things in my head, but isn't that just turning the whole campus into a safe space?
Well, again, what do they mean by safe space? If they mean a space that is free of any contradictory ideas or ideas that disagree with us, that has never actually been my experience at a university.
Right.
Classrooms are, so I'll to use my own examples, classrooms are spaces where students will present ideas that are wildly different from anything that I believe, are wildly different from what their classmates believe. And it's not my job to shut that down. And in fact, that's not what really happens. If someone's, shouting, racial slurs at people, yeah, I'll shut that shit down because, again, hostile learning environment.
Right.
But making a space free from that means that we can focus on attacking very particular ideas that are brought up. We can debate back and forth. I have debates in my classrooms all the time, and I'll push back against. I've got people who are very progressive in my classes, and I'll push back against their ideas, presenting what I feel are the strongest objections to their position.
Right.
They'll push back against other students. conservative students will bring up their view and we bounce those ideas around. That eliminating the kind of hostile, racist sort of hate speech from that setting makes it easier for us to engage in real intellectual, honest discussions about contentious issues in a way that we couldn't do if we had, the Klan guys in the back shouting out all the time.
Right.
So are universities safe spaces? I kind of hope so, because a safe space is a space where people are free to engage in that kind of debate. Now, are they safe spaces in the sense of everyone must agree in lockstep, whatever the cultural Marxists have to say? No, that's a conspiracy theory and a straw man that I've never actually seen in practice.
It's interesting. I always quite often I'll have these discussions with people, and they always have examples of students protesting and shouting down speakers or protesting against professors or teachers that they think are racist for one reason or another, or sexist for one reason or another. I mean, I can never remember the examples per se, but there's always seems to be these examples that they bring forward to say, like, isn't this an example of students running the school and shutting down these kinds of discussions that you seem to be having in your classroom?
Sure. I think you can always find examples of that, which is unsurprising given that in terms of generational cohorts, millennials and the upcoming generation, upwards of 50% of all of us go to universities or will go to a university. We're talking about a continental, in North America, we're talking about tens of millions of people attending universities. Are you going to find some people that just do not understand what the hell they're on about? Yeah, that's yeah. And a university doesn't, when you cross into onto university property, you don't become this elevated contemplative, right? You're still the same person you were on the other side of the road.
Right.
Yeah, you might bring that in. On the other hand, sometimes some of these selectively edited YouTube clips that pop up are a small slice of a much larger debate that may in fact have some merit.
Right.
If you've got an instructor that's talking, using racial slurs or being overtly sexist or transphobic or homophobic, again, that's minimizing that's creating a hostile learning environment that actually shuts those students who might want to learn that stuff out of that discussion. Processing that, isn't that free expression? Isn't that free speech?
Yeah. Sometimes this free speech discussion seems to only want to go one way, right?
Well, it does, because we're talking about the culture war, right? I mean, all of this stuff that I see online, all the stuff that I hear, this is a new phase of a very long historical process, right?
Right.
The culture wars have been around since 19 always. Like,
right.
This is every generation discovers them anew. The PC culture, this isn't a 2000s phenomenon. This was popping up in the early 90s.
Yeah.
I have a book on my shelf that it's a politically correct fairy tale book that was published in the early 90s.
Oh, wow.
It's the same fight.
Right. That's actually really interesting. So you mentioned that you're a PhD candidate in sociology?
Yeah.
Okay. So what do you think of the idea that, like, a lot of people push back on the new-ish definitions of racism and sexism that combine prejudice plus power?
Right.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, when we're talking about sexism and racism, when we're talking about those academically, we are referring to systems, so systemic level, or
right.
what we would call like discrimination or social inequality at societal levels. Under that definition, yeah, broadly speaking, prejudice plus power is a good way of understanding these social processes. you can hate on women all you want. You can hate on people of color all you want. But if you don't have access to the levels of the levers of power, right? If you can't make policy, if you can't shut people out of elected office, or if you can't write laws, then your bigotry remains just that. It's your personal bigotry. But once you get groups of people who share in those same beliefs coming together and then getting into positions of power, all of a sudden that bigotry takes on a whole different meaning, because now people can legislate around it. And what examples do we see of that? Well, in the United States, you have debates around, for example, access to abortion. And women were systematically shut out of a lot of the top-level meetings. There's that thing going around on Twitter, that picture of a room filled with white men.
Signing
Exactly. So that is an institutional level sexism.
Right.
Men deciding for women without women's input how women's bodies will be legislated. So is that institutional sexism? Yeah. Is it prejudice plus power? Sure it is. Clearly these guys don't seem to think that women can make these decisions for themselves. Or even really have a valid position, because if they did, they would have invited the women in, and they didn't.
Right.
I mean, are we talking? Sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was going to say at the individual level, when we're talking about can individuals hate other people, and is that racist? Yeah, sure it is. But it's a different kind of racism. It's a different level of racism or sexism or xenophobia. If I think that immigrants are literally the worst and I don't want them in, my xenophobia is small scale. I can't really do anything about it.
Right.
If I'm Donald Trump and I decide that the Muslims are a coming to get us, look, I can write an executive order and shut down movement of Muslims across American borders.
Yeah.
Power matters in discussions of discrimination.
For sure. So I guess it seems like then people are getting confused when they use the term racism without the qualifier of institutional or systemic. And then I've seen a lot of back and forths where people say, well, no, that's not racist because those people have no power. But it sounds like that is a type of racism. It's just not systemic racism.
Sure. People can be racist. It doesn't matter the color of their skin. People can be sexist. It doesn't matter their gender.
Right.
We see this a lot. And that's fine if we're confining our debate to, well, you personally don't like me because of my gender and I personally don't like you. The amount of damage we can do to one another is fairly small.
Right.
But if we start talking about in the United States, if you're defunding Planned Parenthood, they provide primary health care for millions and millions of women. That's quite a bit more harm.
Right.
Rooted in the same beliefs, but magnified, amplified through power. Power, institutional power is a force multiplier, right?
For sure.
And so what I see online is a lot of equivocation where people use words without those qualifications. That's why when academics we talk, this is why we talk so much, because we have to qualify.
Yeah, everything's very precise.
It has to be, because we're trying to convey an idea that has some pretty specific meanings.
Right. No, that's kind of where my head was at, but I've seen people on both sides confusing the two, and
sure.
it causes quite a bit of conflict.
This is why I avoid internet fights.
Yeah.
because why bother? Honestly, why bother?
That's right.
The debates online, so debates in academia through peer review and others, those debates are ideally supposed to be a joint quest for the truth.
Right.
That's what they're supposed to be. If you and I are sitting down at a conference or something and we are engaging in a spirited discussion about racism or whatever, our goal ultimately should be to understand each other and then together arrive at the truth. Online, however, we get slap fights that are designed to prove which side is the worst.
Yeah.
That's not debate. There's nothing intellectual about that. that's flexing. And why bother?
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. I've been recently pulling back from the online discussions myself.
It's one of the reasons why I left the atheist movement in general.
Right. Yeah, it has definitely some, I guess a fair word would be toxic
Sure.
aspects to it. So I guess, what are your thoughts on something like, do people who are pro-social justice sometimes use the terms like racist or sexist to shut down conversation?
I think that you could almost certainly find examples of that happening. Sure. Again, because I can't be everywhere. I can't see what everyone does.
Right.
But in my view, more often than not, what's happening is two people are discussing an issue. One person maybe knows more about that issue than the other, or is more sensitive to nuance than the other. And the one person says something objectionable, and the other person responds with, what you just said is sexist, or could be construed as sexist, or has sexist undertones or racist undertones or whatever.
Right.
And the other person goes, I'm not a racist. I'm not a sexist. And then the discussion breaks down because that person goes on the defensive and says, no, listen, I'm not that thing. I'm a good person.
Right.
But that's not really what was being said, right? What was being said is that the terms that were being used were themselves problematic. That's not shutting down a discussion. If a thing is, if I'm talking to someone and they start espousing, we must secure for ourselves secure our existence for ourselves and a future for white children or whatever. They start spouting white supremacist garbage.
Right.
I'm not shutting down discussion by saying, okay, what you just said right there, you are literally repeating the words of a neo-Nazi.
Right.
I'm not God-winning an argument. I'm not shutting down an argument. I'm saying the thing you just said, that is literally a quote from this Nazi. That's racist. If the person goes, oh, well, you're shutting down conversation. No, I'm calling it what it is.
Yeah.
These terms have definitions, and if it meets that criteria, then that's what it is. What often happens, the breakdown, is when the person says, okay, what you just said that was a racist thing. And the person who said it goes, no, fuck it, I'm out. I don't want to talk about this anymore. Or the other person says, what you said is racist and I'm not going to talk with you anymore. Fine, that's your right. It's your right. No one is obligated to you're not obligated to continue a discussion.
Right.
But I think, in my view, what happens more often is that someone says, okay, what you said is problematic, and I'd like to talk to you about this problematic thing. And the person goes, you're calling me a sexist or racist. I want nothing to do with this.
Yeah. Yeah. It almost seems like the reaction more than the intent of the calling out of the said behavior or whatever. It's the reaction to that calling out that ends up shutting down the conversation.
Sure. Introspection and self-reflection and admitting to ourselves when we make a mistake is really, really hard. And it's really hard when the things that we're being called on are especially sort of loaded or charged terms. Saying that something someone said is racist, that's a pretty heavy thing to say. And it takes an awful lot of humility and sort of, I would say, a certain level of emotional maturity to stop, look inside, and say, maybe that was. Or even worse, to say to the person who said that to you, what was it about what I said?
Right.
What was it that was problematic? Can you tell me what I did so that I can understand where you're coming from? That takes a suspension of ego, a suspension of hostilities, in another, to put it another way, that I think a lot of people don't have. And I think online it's even worse because your name isn't attached to it. You can say whatever you want.
Yeah. Yeah. And even, there seems to be like you say, like this online, it's very, everybody's just trying to demonstrate how smart they are and how much better they are. So,
yeah, there's certainly a lot of that.
What do you think is accomplished when people try to point out hypocrisy or racism by people of color or sexism by women? Does that is it have an intent, like a purpose, do you think? Or is it just to derail the conversation or distract from what's already being discussed?
Well, I think it depends. As you know, good answer. That's how I'm going to start all my answers.
Yeah.
But if the discussion is about something else, then pointing out hypocrisy is a red herring, right? It's a way of throwing off the discussion. If you want to have a discussion about a topic, throwing in irrelevant details or throwing in something that is not germane to that specific discussion is a derailment.
Right.
And it gives you an out so that you don't have to talk about these troubling things anymore. If the topic itself is hypocrisy, yeah, then okay, fine. Now we're having this discussion and you point out something that's hypocritical. Yeah, we can sort of circle around that and take a look. Often I think what's happening is it's a rhetorical device that gets thrown out. We're having a challenging discussion, something that's difficult. I'm feeling my back is getting up, right, because some of my beliefs are being challenged or whatever, and I immediately throw out this term as a way of saying, see, they're just as bad.
Right.
They're just as bad. And because they're just as bad, why are you attacking me? We're all the same. Right? There's a cliche that I've in some online communities that I'm a part of. Both sides are bad, so vote Republican. In other words, both sides are equally bad, so I'll just keep doing what I'm doing. Right?
Right.
Because, sure, you've said that something I've said is problematic, but look at what this unrelated person over in this other discussion in this other time and context said. That's just as bad.
That's
so
equally bad.
so get off your moral high horse. I actually don't find a whole lot of good comes out of it.
Right.
It doesn't seem that it's directed to any real purpose, except to do this, to point out, nope, I'm going to tear you down. Now we're both on the same level, and now none of us have to change.
It seems that I have seen there are people, it seems, who spend an awful lot of time focusing on this reverse racism or reverse sexism that they call it. And I just wonder, what ultimately are they accomplishing? Because the systemic issues aren't fixed by that pointing out of this reverse individual actions, I guess. So I'm often confused by why they're even doing that.
Yeah, I to be honest, it's one of the things I don't really seem to get, and I see this a lot. In passing on YouTube videos and in internet fights. Right. And I don't see what solutions that moves people towards. And I don't see, yeah, it's not one of those things of like, oh, well, okay, that helps our discussion, that actually clarifies something. It doesn't. It just bogs it down more. And if we're focused on trying to establish common ground so that we can work towards solutions or whatever, it seems that that's not really, you're not helping, sort of.
Yeah. So I guess I did have this discussion the other day, and the guy I was talking to, he brought up a bunch of things that Black Lives Matter has done, or as an organization, that seemed to be problematic, like having an anti-Semite speaking at one of their events, and some of the tweets by founding members of Black Lives Matter. And I wonder, is there something wrong with the Black Lives Matter as an organization that kind of is feeding these kinds of things, or is it just individual actions and individual instances of negative behavior, and should we just kind of brush those to the side and focus on the main topic at hand?
It's not about brushing them aside. Recognizing that these things happen, and I'm unfamiliar with these two things, or these two or three right. things. But let's assume for a moment that's what went down. Right. Okay, that happened. No, we don't brush them aside. We deal with them. We don't deal with them by stopping everything, or by saying that, oh, well, this one asshole at this one group in this one place said X, or this one person on Twitter tweeted something. Therefore, the whole movement is bad.
Right.
No, what's more interesting to me is looking at Black Lives Matter is a social movement. It's a new kind of social movement.
Right.
It's decentralized, right? It seems largely anti-hierarchical.
Right.
There's no real leader of the movement. There are people who kick-started it, who sort of founded it, and they retain some sort of pride of place, but I don't see a lot of people deferring to them.
True.
So what we see then is this loose, amorphous network of people, all, standing in solidarity around the same social issues, which are real and pressing issues, making decisions in their own small groups to have speakers or to tweet. What's interesting to me is how do these groups deal with those people? So the person who is anti-Semitic, how did other Black Lives Matter
right
groups or allies deal with that? Did they brush it off? Did they embrace the person? Did they say that person doesn't speak for us and push them off to the side? In other words, what I'm more interested in terms of the social movement, Black Lives Matter, is how do they police themselves?
Right.
So in Occupy, back in the day in Occupy, you'd see Occupy was the same, right? It had no hierarchy.
Yeah.
But what would happen is within the group, you'd sometimes get these nutters, the tinfoil hatters, who would jump up, and it's the reptiloids, the Rothschilds and the reptiloids. They're coming to get us. What did the movement do? It punted those guys out to the fringes.
Right.
It said, yeah, no, you do you, man, but that's not what we're about. That's what I want to see. I'd like to see how the Black Lives Matter movement, insofar as it is a singular thing, which it isn't. But how do these groups deal with that? How do they police their own? If they embrace them, that's a problem, speaks to a larger systemic problem. If they punt them out and we never hear from them again, then it seems that that's the movement's immune system working as it should.
Right. No, that sounds like a pretty good answer to me. I quite often when I'm having these discussions with people, I'll just let them talk. And I don't often have the information at hand to address what they're saying.
Right.
So I'll just listen and I'll say, okay, well, that in this instance, that sounds really bad. I wonder what the context is, like further context is regarding that. And quite often there's no back and forth because it's just part of a broader point or whatever they're trying to say. That, like, actually this person that I was talking with, he doesn't like Black Lives Matter at all. So he was, I think, in his own way trying to kind of point out that this is a bad group and a bad kind of movement.
Sure.
And these are the reasons that he thinks it's a bad movement. But
yeah, we see this an example within the skeptical, and not as much the skeptical, but the atheist community, which as a community has done some things to piss me off in the past. But we used to in the one of the groups I set up or helped to set up, we would often talk about young Earth creationism, and everyone was obviously opposed to creationism, but people would say, well, these creationists, the Catholics and the Protestants or the Anglicans and the whatever, and they would just throw out these different religious groups and say, well, look, Ken Ham has this ark thing, therefore everybody, all Christians who believe in creationism are all equally stupid because they're all doing this thing. And I would point out to them, well, technically it's true that Catholics are creationists, but they believe that the world is 4.5 billion years old. They believe
right.
that humans evolved from lower animals or from common ancestors with other primates, but that at some point in our history, God reached down, touched them, and imbued them with a soul. That's a markedly different perspective than young right?
Earth. Yeah.
But the point was that the people making these arguments were so invested in destroying the concept of creationism as a whole that they had absolutely no problem making some pretty basic cognitive and empirical mistakes.
Right.
So this guy, he doesn't like Black Lives Matter in general. He's ideologically opposed or whatever reason he gives. But he starts finding these small examples, and he thinks that if he can connect the dots on 2 or 3 of these small examples, it'll show how the whole system is poisonous.
Right.
But that's not actually how we ascertain trends. The plural of anecdote isn't data, right? It's
right. Yeah. I've used that argument a couple times, actually.
it's a good old skeptical trope.
Yeah, that's right. I did in an online discussion. I made that argument. Like, these are just examples or anecdotes per se. Like, these are outliers that are behaving badly, and they don't represent the larger. I could even say they don't represent the left, say, and it didn't take, like, it was like, oh, but what about these hundreds of examples that I have? Well, but there's millions of people who ascribe to these views.
So it's what we call whataboutism.
Right.
What about nothing? If we're talking Black Lives Matter, we're not talking about Black Lives Matter Vancouver or Black Lives Matter Atlanta. We're talking about Black Lives Matter as a constellation of social movements.
Right.
I just saw a video the other day of a Black Lives Matter group supported by Hispanic and sort of pro-immigration allies in, I believe it was California, standing around having a poetry slam. That was their protest.
Oh,
their
nice.
protest was a poetry slam. And a woman came up to them and started throwing out racial slurs, calling them the N-word, calling them all sorts of things. And their response was, "We love you, ma'am. Have a good night, ma'am. We love you, ma'am. Have a good night, ma'am." So for every anecdote of some anti-Semitic whack job that stands up, we find other anecdotes that directly refute that kind of behavior.
Right.
That's why dueling anecdotes isn't going to do anything except make the person launching these attacks, these anecdotal attacks, feel good.
Right.
If we look at this at the overall trend, we see that the trend is something different.
That's a very good point.
I hope so.
Well, I mean,
Just made it up.
I used to have some, like, in my 20s, I had some very, what would be now considered problematic views.
Sure.
And
name a person that didn't.
Right, eh? And over the years, I've slowly but surely, like, I started calling myself a feminist probably 4 or 5 years ago, and I started calling myself like a social justice advocate, like maybe a year or two ago.
Right.
And the more that I've progressed in this direction, I've seen more and more backlash against this social justice. I don't know if it's just the way the culture I'm immersing myself in more, but.
Well, I think that there's something to that. I know that as sort of my own views have evolved. At first, I really started getting more involved in activism. I used to run a blog that was it was well read, but I've since shut it down. I used to do guest blogging on free thought blogs.
Okay.
Until under with one of the bloggers that was there, but the longer the more toxic I saw the community become, I sort of fell away from it. I just couldn't do it anymore. But I found that it's not just like, if I could sort of, it's not just you. This is the culture we're living in right now. I would say North American culture more broadly, but the culture we're living in is becoming increasingly partisan.
Right.
But it's also becoming increasingly anti-intellectual. And so having good faith discussions, utilizing the principle of charity, which says that the person we're debating with, when they make a point, we should, rather than nitpick any structural weaknesses or like pedantic weaknesses,
right,
should work with them to make sure that the argument is the strongest possible argument they could be launching, and then critiquing that. It seems that we've abandoned a lot of that.
Yeah.
And we've fallen into these two ideological camps, the left and
yeah,
whatever
else the other thing is.
Yeah. But it also is a little bit difficult for people who are advocating for social justice, because social justice, the recognition of social inequality and the drive to fix these issues, that is the minority position.
Right.
Like,
yeah, they're like that Dave Rubin that I was mentioning earlier, he's got on his Patreon, he's got, I don't know, thousands and thousands of supporters. Like,
sure,
he's making $100,000 an episode or some ridiculous number. Like, it's insane.
Sure.
Meanwhile, some of the best on the pro social justice side are, maybe making a couple hundred. So,
oh yeah, if they're lucky.
Yeah.
I mean, advocating for the downtrodden isn't, that's not a money making scheme, right?
No, that's right.
But being a champion of the status quo, everybody wants that.
Yeah.
Rush Limbaugh is a millionaire.
Right.
Alex Jones is now mainstream.
No kidding.
Who'd have thought that an unhinged, like, weapons grade crazy internet shouting man would be able to say that he is in some way influencing White House policy.
No kidding.
The status quo, there's big money in protecting it.
Yeah.
There is not as much money in pushing back against it, and there's an increased risk, right? If marginalized peoples are given if the struggle for equality allows marginalized people to take their rightful place in society, it increases. So if we want to be all market driven, it increases competition among labor bases, right? Or
Right.
in a labor force that historically was dominated by white men. Now white men, in addition to having to compete with other white men, now have to compete with women, now have to compete with minorities and marginalized peoples. It makes it so they have to work that much harder.
Right.
That's not a loss, man. That's just all of a sudden having to live up to your potential.
Yeah, that's submitting to true capitalism.
This is the thing is I find this all the time. If you want to be a capitalist, then if you love capitalism, you should love the idea of competition.
Yeah, that's right.
If you get burned, then neoliberal ideology tells us that you got burned because it's your own damn fault.
Yeah,
get better.
That's right.
The social justice position is that if you got burned, it could be because you did something shitty or because you're incompetent, but it might also be these other reasons that we should investigate a little bit.
Yeah,
and do our best to eliminate those other reasons as much as possible.
Yeah. I was actually recently in a debate on the subject of no platforming on university campuses. And my argument was that all things being equal, like, universities have to do a cost benefit analysis. What are they losing by no platforming somebody versus what are they gaining by giving them a platform? And they have to do this equation when they make these decisions. Yeah. And I said, market forces apply because students will go to a different school. Donors will give money to different schools. Like, they'll pull money. They have reputation capital that they have to worry about. Like, it's an economic argument in favor of no platforming, I thought. But
well, sure. I mean, universities are increasingly under the gun for funding. Back in the day, we used to be far more heavily funded by government subsidies,
right,
which was great in the sense that it meant instructors and faculty had greater freedom to devote their time to either research or teaching. Now, under these increasingly neoliberal models, universities are seen as profit. They have to make money.
Yeah.
And the way you make money is by bringing in funding. And the way you do that is by announcing research projects or whatever, which takes time away from teaching, which was always
right.
the job. But yeah, universities have to, they have to make these kinds of decisions. Or, so UVic is a great example. A philanthropist, a very, very wealthy philanthropist, donated a few $1 million to the university to open up a research school and a program of study looking at the history of transgender folk in North America,
to
look at transgender issues, to look at research into the experiences of transgender folk. That wouldn't have happened if the university had a reputation for being transphobic.
Right. Yeah. They have to worry about that type of thing. Eh?
Yeah, and so it's a benefit for all of us. On the one hand, the university gets its money. Woohoo! Yay for the university! They can hire another sub interim assistant secretary for the administration.
Right.
But it also meant that we could hire as a university. The university could hire researchers, research assistants, grad students, teaching assistants, all like a whole apparatus to study a chronically understudied issue. It advances knowledge. We couldn't have done that if UVic had a reputation for being a sort of a platform for reactionaries.
Right. Sounds like a good argument for no platforming to me.
Yeah. The other argument is look, I think that controversial positions, we ought to listen to them if they're good.
Yeah, if they're good.
Being controversial isn't enough.
Yeah.
I've got an uncle that's controversial. It's because he's old and racist. Everybody's got one. Everybody's got an old racist uncle that says shit that you delete their forward emails all the time, right?
For sure.
Controversial isn't enough.
Yeah.
Controversial but good? Yeah, that's a challenge. That's something that needs to be addressed. But things like, debating the merits of, I don't know, whatever. Debating the merits of segregation. Yeah, we had that fight 50 years ago.
Right.
It was found to be without merit, and it was abandoned as bad. Debates about eugenics. Yeah, eugenics is pseudoscience.
Yeah.
We've known that for a half century. Why should we have someone, I've got this great idea. I'd really like to talk to you about this crazy new idea called eugenics. No. It's controversial, but bad.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a bad argument. Letting every Tom, Dick, and Harry who has a YouTube channel, that's not enough to make them worthy of coming into university. Are they influential? Do they have, Milo Yiannopoulos? The stuff he says isn't even interesting. It's the same thought terminating. Yeah, it's the same thought terminating cliches we've been hearing from social conservatives since the 70s. There's nothing new. He just says it with an English accent, some dirty words, and while occupying a quasi-deviant space as a conservative gay man.
Right, yeah.
It's a show. If I want a show, I'll go to the circus.
I suppose one of the examples that people bring up when I talk about no platforming, I guess I didn't intend to just spend more time on no platforming, but is Ayaan Hirsi Ali at the University of Calgary.
Right.
So I wonder what your thoughts are on that, or like, was that a warranted no platforming or deplatforming?
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with what the specific complaints were about her. I know that in general she has been accused of misrepresenting her background.
Right.
I know that she's been accused of effectively misrepresenting her own history, in a way that overemphasizes the lurid details and de-emphasizes the more mundane stuff. I think people were also probably pissed that she. I think is she still employed by the American Enterprise Institute?
I am not sure.
They're a pretty right-wing conservative think tank.
Yeah.
And
she is a pretty conservative ex-Muslim, so
sure, but there are plenty of conservative ex-Muslims around. There are plenty of ex-Muslims around who can make powerful, compelling arguments for why Islam is a problem, or why there's a problem with Islam.
Right.
Which reminds me, there's actually a book called The Trouble with Islam, written by a woman in the early 2000s, and she's basically writing as someone who's culturally Muslim. It's an interesting book, but anyways,
it sounds familiar. I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, I think she was the one that said that one of the interpretations of the Quran said that when you die and go to heaven, it's not 72 virgins, it was 72 raisins.
Oh yeah, yeah,
which would be a terrible disappointment to ISIS.
Yeah.
So I'm not too sure what exactly the specifics around Ali not being deplatformed, but it could just be that they think that she just isn't of the caliber that ought to be speaking at a university, or they may have had some more specific complaints.
Right. Yeah, it's just one of the examples that people tend to bring up, and I mean, I actually quite like her books. I've read Heretic, and I've read whatever the other one was, and I quite like them. But I don't mind some of the things she's written online and whatnot. But when I was having this discussion about no platforming, I said, well, sometimes the university may make a decision that I disagree with. That's just the case, the way these things might play out sometimes. So
yeah, you absolutely have the right to protest that.
Right.
But yeah, I'm not as familiar with I mean, I've from my time in atheist circles, I remember Ali's name, but I remember reading more of Miriam Namazi.
Oh, yeah,
and her criticisms. But
I quite like her too. So
yeah, I remember that Ali. I don't remember if I've ever read anything of hers.
Fair enough. I guess I've used an hour and 20 minutes of your time. That's probably plenty.
Well, that's fine.
I appreciate it.
Hey, it was a pleasure hanging out and talking with you.
Do you have like a blog that you still do, or like a website that you run, or anything that you want people to go towards?
I keep a pretty low profile these days. I ran afoul of some men's rights activists who
we didn't talk about feminism.
Yeah, they sort of were attacking my social media, printing my home address, contacting my supervisors. So I keep a pretty low profile. About the only thing you could say is that about the only thing I'm doing right now is plugging away at my dissertation, and I'm teaching a course on the sociology of Star Trek.
Oh, nice.
In fall 2017. Yeah, so we're going to use Star Trek as a vehicle to examine sociological issues, which it should be quite interesting. I hope it's interesting.
It sounds like a kind of class that I would like to see or take.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
For sure. Well, thanks very much. Okay, so that was my interview with Edwin. I said that I would try to take notes and be critical of the things he said. I'm having trouble, though. We talked a lot about ideas, and we didn't talk about people or specific claims. We talked a lot about ideas, and he did make a couple of empirical claims, and he provided me with studies that he was talking about. I uploaded those to my Google Drive, and I will provide links in the show notes. So before I go any further with my notes, I want to say that this has kind of been a busy week, and I haven't been able to do the fact-checking work on this episode that I would have liked to. I also want to apologize for the lower quality of the audio in this one. I tried to go through and remove as many of the clicks and taps as I could, but often there were just too many, and eventually I ended up just not having the time to deal with it. So with that, I'll just go through my notes quick from here on, and if you want to check on anything I missed, then I encourage you to do that, and I'm very interested in what you might find. First, I couldn't find much on the correlation between gender and income level, or race and income level. I mean, I found lots, but nothing that just said, here are the stats and this is how they correlate. There were plenty of papers that looked at the impact of race or gender in income inequality on various outcomes like health or happiness or some other type of outcome, but nothing that said, hey, this is the way that this looks. Like, this is gender correlates with lower income, or race correlates with lower income. I'm sure that that's out there. I just didn't have the time or ability, I guess, to find it with in the time that I had available to me. I would really like to see that information. If you want to send it to me or share it on my Facebook page, that would be great. So he also noted that there's a correlation between being a disabled person and having a lower socioeconomic status. I don't think this is terribly controversial. This is pretty standard knowledge as far as I can tell, but it's worth checking. He also mentioned that until the 70s, women couldn't get credit cards. And again, this is, I think, relatively well known. I don't have a link or anything to show you this in front of you, but so, I mean, it could be worth looking into, but I just don't think it's that controversial. These are things that people have talked about lots. So we also talked about the resume studies, and this is something that I've had controversy about in the past. So I've done some very real digging into this, but this is also some of the studies that and links that Edwin shared with me. So this is a thing that has studies to back it. These resume studies are real things where experimenters send out resumes with racialized names and quote unquote white names, like standard everyday names that nobody thinks twice about, and then specifically racialized names. And the racialized names got 50% less callbacks than the whatever everyday name that nobody thinks about. So this is a real thing, a real phenomenon that has been studied multiple times. And there will be a couple links to studies in the show notes to help you explore that subject. Something that we touched on very briefly in our discussion is the difference between Canada's free expression and America's free speech. Essentially, it's the difference between what the Constitution of Canada says and the Constitution of America says. But it seems not to just be this legal definition. It seems to, in my opinion, have a reflection in everyday society, in the way that Canadians talk and the way that Americans talk. We both societies have these ideas, and they're expressed in a slightly different ways. And I find that very interesting. Something else that would be really cool to look into would be the University of Alberta disinviting Ernst Zundel in the 90s. If you don't remember from the interview, he's a Holocaust denier, and then he was removed from Canada. I think there's something super interesting going on there that I'd really like to read about. I keep saying it, but I just haven't had the time to do the searches and find the links for these things. Along the same lines as the University of Victoria kicking anti-choice activists off of the campus. This is something that many people use as a point of agreement. We often say that we can agree that anyone can put a soapbox on campus and they can stand on it and rant and rave however they want. They just don't get to dictate which stage they get, and universities don't have to accommodate them if they don't want to. So even no platforming advocates are on the same page as free speech advocates when we say that anyone can put a soapbox on campuses, or at least I thought we were, but it seems that this is not always clear. The anti-choice activists were kicked off of a campus, and I'd like to learn more about that. I'm not sure. I think Edwin said that it was held up by the Supreme Court, but I need to look into it more. I think this is 0 for 2 on people who knew what I was talking about regarding speech codes. I wrote it into my question list, and I intended to bring it up with everybody because I thought everybody knew what this was, but apparently not. So this is something that we'll see how many people actually have an opinion on speech codes before I'm done. I made a claim myself about Dave Rubin's income per episode or per month or whatever, and I actually have no idea what he makes. But the point remains valid that defending the status quo is worth money compared to standing up for marginalized groups. You can also look at Jordan B. Peterson's Patreon or his GoFundMe or whatever it was. For like defending trans people isn't making anyone rich, but Peterson is making 30 grand off of his transphobic bigotry. I think eugenics is something that needs to be covered in the Woo Report on Brainstorm, my other show. It's a pseudoscience that there are still proponents of. And we've covered flat earthers, so I think eugenics might be one on the list. Eugenics might make the list. That's it for this episode. Edwin doesn't have a blog or podcast or anything, so there's not really anything to plug, but I really want to thank him for his time and input. I want to give a huge shout out to Jeremiah Traeger, who made a meme of a bunch of podcasters, and it included me. It was one of those D&D alignment charts, and I was the true neutral position. I actually really appreciate that, even though I don't see myself as true neutral. He could have picked a lot of other people for that spot, and I think it's super cool that he included me. I also want to give a huge shout out to Chris Watson, who shared the show around and gave me way too much credit when he compared me to Thomas Smith. The words of encouragement are really appreciated. His show is the Podunk Polymath podcast, and he's a good interviewer in his own right. He does a great show and is a genuinely good guy. I would also like to apologize for having to delete that post from my timeline after Chris tagged me in it. I'm finding that I really need to moderate my page very strictly sometimes, and the conversation underneath that post, it got out of hand, I guess you could say. I don't think I've done it yet in any of the episodes, but I really want to thank my patrons, Marissa McCool, Chris Watson, and Trav Mamone. They contribute to the show through Patreon at patreon.com/hardcoreskeptic. They started supporting me before I ever put out an episode, and I really appreciate the support and the encouragement. This makes it seem like, even though there's only 3 people, it makes it seem like somebody gives a shit about what I'm doing. So if you want to help the show out, I've got it set up as a per month account rather than a per episode account, so you never get caught paying for more episodes than you expected to. I'm also looking for a couple more interviews for the social justice series. I know that it's probably long enough, but there's always seems to be more things happening and more details that need to be dealt with. I'm looking for an ex-Muslim who would be interested. I need a college student who went to school in the 2016-2017 school year who may have an interest in social justice. And I'd like suggestions on a person who is well known and respected in the skeptic community, but who hasn't declared pro or anti-social justice. Or if they have, then it's only in a minor capacity rather than the full-blown SJW or anti-SJW. So any suggestions in that vein are greatly appreciated. I want to let you know as well that if you dislike my commentary after the interview with Dustin, I guess he plans on rebutting my commentary in an upcoming episode of The Wayward Atheist. I suggest you go check it out. And that's, I think, all I have to say for this episode. You can find more of these episodes at Spreaker.com/show/The Hardcore Skeptic Examines. You can find me on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and just about anywhere else you can find podcasts. Make sure to follow me on Twitter at Hardcore Skeptic and like my page on Facebook. It's facebook.com/Hardcore Skeptic. And I accept pretty much any friend request. It's Corey Johnston. If you want to email me, you can send any thoughts to mail@brainstormblog.net. Remember to check out my other shows, Brainstorm and Positively Skeptical. You can find Brainstorm at thebrainstormpodcast.com and brainstormblog.net. And Positively Skeptical will be out on Spreaker as soon as we have more episodes out. Thanks so much for listening, and remember, the truth matters.